our 10:30 section. We've got 4 speakers here from 10:30 to about 10:50. And the first one is Aditi Dubey, and so from the University of Maryland. And this is a NESARE project. The title is Evaluations of Economic Benefits and Long-Term Sustainability of Neonicotinoid Seed Treatment Use in the Mid-Atlantic. So Aditi, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'd also just like to acknowledge my other funding sources, the Maryland Soybean Board and the Maryland Grain Producers Utilization Board. So neonicotinoids are the most widely used class of insecticides in the world. And the reasons for their popularity is that they have pretty low mammalian toxicity and they're systemic, so they can be applied in a number of different ways. And the way that they're most widely used, especially in grain production, is as seed treatments, to the point that close to 100% of corn and 30 to 40% of soybean in this country is planted with treated seeds. And they're considered pretty low risk, but in the last few years, a lot of research has shown that they can actually have some pretty serious non-target impacts. And the neonicotinoids from seed treatments can interact with the environment in a number of different ways. So as you can see in this diagram, when neonicotinoids are applied as seed treatments, only a very small percentage of the insecticide actually gets taken up by the crop. The majority of it remains in the soil, from where it can end up in waterways and in other parts of the environment. So for my research, I'm focusing on the chemicals that are in the crop, on the impact that they can have in the soil, on soil invertebrates and soil microbes, and also the potential for them to be taken up by non-target plants. And given that they're so widely used and that they can have far-reaching impacts on the environment, the use of these treatments may not be sustainable in the long term. So today I'm just going to focus on the insecticides that are actually present in the crop. And I'd like to make 2 points. One is that they are actually only active in the plant for 4 to 6 weeks after planting. So they only provide protection from early season pests. And I also just want to stress the fact that their use is prophylactic and they're being applied at the time of planting. So unless you consistently have major pest problems, you're using them without knowing whether you'll need them. And that's not really in keeping with the principles of IPM. So could I get the next slide, please? So my specific goals here are to determine the impact of neonicotinoid seed treatments on arthropod pests, on plant growth and yield, and on non-target beneficial arthropods. And I'm also interested in whether repeated use of these treatments year after year is having any cumulative impacts. So my study system is a commonly used crop rotation in this area: full season soybean, winter wheat, followed by double crop soybean and corn. And I have 4 treatments that I'm looking at: control or untreated seed, seed only treated with fungicide, seed treated with cruiser or thiamethoxam and fungicide, and seed treated with gaucho or imidacloprid and fungicide. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to talk about some of the results that I saw from visual scouting for beneficial and pest insects in soybean and wheat. And I want to stress the fact that overall pest pressure during the study was really low. So any of the pests that we did see were well below the treatment threshold. So in soybean, we sampled once visually for insects in full season soybean and twice in double crop soybean. And in full season soybean, the primary beneficial insects that we saw were minute pirate bugs and predatory thrips. And the main pests that we saw were potato leafhopper and plant thrips. And all of these insects were significantly reduced by the use of the treatments. In double crop soybean, we really only saw the beneficial predatory thrips and the pest plant thrips. And both of these were reduced by the thiamethoxam seed treatment, but not by the imidacloprid. In winter wheat, we sampled 5 times, twice in the winter and 3 times in the spring. And the only insect pests that we saw consistently were cereal aphids. We also saw a little bit of cereal leaf beetle, but only in the spring and not really enough to analyze. And we didn't see a lot of natural enemies. There were very low rates of parasitism in the aphids, but we didn't really see any predators that you might expect in the system, like ladybugs. And so given that overall pest pressure was so low, even though we did see some pest suppression in the study because the number of aphids were reduced in the fall, overall there was no impact on yield in any of the crops, both soybeans, wheat, and corn. So given that pest pressure is usually pretty low in our area, and the neonicotinoid seed treatments do have non-target impacts, their use in Maryland grain production may not really be beneficial or necessary. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. That's interesting. Is this the first year of a study of, or sorry, maybe I missed that. Is this a longer term study?
So it's a 3-year study, and we finished the field part this year, but I still have a lot of stuff that I'm working on in the lab with microbial analysis and a lot more insects that I'm looking at.
Okay, yeah, this is really interesting, and it's good to see this work being done. Thank you. We're going to move on to our next talk on laser scarecrows for preventing bird damage in sweet corn, and this is Rebecca Brown with the University of Rhode Island, and this is also a Northeast SARE project. So Rebecca, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So yes, I'm talking about a somewhat different group of pests, namely birds. And I've been working on testing laser scarecrows for controlling bird damage on peri-urban farms. Birds, particularly blackbirds, starlings, and crows, are a major problem in sweet corn for fresh market because they damage the husks, and once the husks have been damaged, the ears are unmarketable. A lot of our fresh market sweet corn, of course, is grown in close proximity to urban suburban areas, which are the markets for the sweet corn. So you have a lot of opportunity for conflict with non-farm neighbors. And at present, the leading control method for the birds is the use of bird scare devices, particularly propane cannons. And these use sound, loud booms, to startle the birds and dissuade them from feeding in the crop. But the noise has to be repeated as much as every 5 minutes. And it's extremely annoying to everybody within hearing distance. And since these are loud noises, that distance can be quite large. This has led to really big conflicts between farmers and communities. Conflicts that have resulted in threats of lawsuits. Can I have the next slide, please? So can you click on the image, please? We'll see if it starts the video. All right, I guess we lost the video functionality on this, but this is a laser scarecrow. And basically we've been looking at it as a solution to the bird damage problem using light rather than sound to scare the birds. And the advantage of light, of course, is that it doesn't carry as far, so it's not going to be as annoying to non-farm neighbors. Birds are extremely sensitive to light. The birds that we're looking at here, the crows, the starlings, the blackbirds, use light and shadow as a primary way of detecting the presence of their predators, primarily hawks. And so they're made very uneasy by moving lights. And birds are also much more sensitive to green light than humans are. So these laser units use a green laser beam, and it rotates and moves constantly. It's controlled by a computer in there. And basically that moving light over the tops of the tassels is what works to dissuade the birds from entering the field. Can I have the next slide, please? So we did on-farm trials this summer. We had a replicated controlled trial at the URI research farm where we got a statistically significant reduction in damage with protection, but we had very low bird pressure, so none of it would impress growers. But we also did unreplicated trials on commercial sweet corn farms in Rhode Island and southeastern New England. And what we were finding is that in fields with a history of greater than 80% crop loss, we were getting less than 10% crop loss when we protected the crop with the laser scarecrows. We were also finding that nearby fields that were not protected still had very high, 80 to 100% crop loss. So it wasn't an issue of the birds not being present in the surrounding area. It was that the birds were not feeding in the protected fields. And in fact, we would observe the birds still hanging out in the hedgerows and trees around the fields, but they would not enter the fields. So this is an ongoing project. We will be doing additional trials next summer to confirm the results. We are also evaluating the scarecrows for protecting against other types of birds, particularly Canada geese that feed on turf and on cover crops. We're looking at the scarecrows for use in grapes and berries. And we are looking for a commercial partner who is interested in manufacturing these devices. So that's all I have.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. So my one question is, what are the bird species, what are the most common bird species that are the problem?
So in sweet corn, the birds that are the problem are primarily red-winged blackbirds and starlings.
Okay.
It varies some between farms and also over the course of the growing season.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yep.
So we're gonna move along to our next presentation. This is Martha Mutschler-Chu, and she is coming to us from Cornell University, and this is a NESARE project. The title is Combining Resistances to Major Bacterial, Fungal, and Oomycete Diseases of Northeast Adapted Tomato. So Martha, go ahead.
Are you moving the slides?
Yes.
Okay, please do. Okay, move the next slide. Whoops, up again. I think you're on the 5th slide. Okay, so in prior work, my program has combined 2 resistance genes for late blight, 2 for septorial leaf spot, and 1 for early blight tolerance to create tomato lines controlling these 3 diseases, which are the 3 foliar diseases of tomato in the Northeast. This led to the release of the hybrids Iron Lady and Stellar by High Mowing Organic Seed and Pan American Seed respectively. A 3rd hybrid's coming to the market in the near future with the same components of resistance. The weak link in this resistance is the early blight tolerance. Our current tolerance, which comes from the original line Campbell's 1943, protects the stems and the peduncles and thereby the fruit, but not the leaves, although it does reduce the number of sprays needed from 7 or 8 to 2 a season, so it's not without some effect on the leaves. Now, in a project where we're transferring resistance to bacterial and speck and bacterial spot to tomato, we serendipitously found a new form of early blight resistance that protects the leaves, but not the stems and peduncles. So this project is basically bringing together the 2 forms of early blight tolerance to get control of the disease on all parts of the plant. Next slide, please. So first objective, we have to genetically map the first form, the Campbell 1943 form of resistance, so we can follow it genetically when we're also selecting for the other form of resistance. Early blight is not the easiest disease to do genetics on because it's an opportunistic disease. Various factors will impact the phenotypic data, the data on disease response, other than the genetics, so we have to control for that. We're going to use breeding populations that we had actually already created in a disease screen to look at the genetics of this leaf form of tolerance. Is it dominant recessive? Is it controlled by 1 or more genes, and map those genes? We actually already started that work this summer. My graduate student, Taylor Anderson, had a marvelous screen this summer and has all the phenotypic data, the DNA, and to do the work on this mapping, just starting to extract the DNA this week. We're going to use the information from objectives 1 and 2 to select in the backcross plants that will have both forms of the early blight resistance into this elite background that already has the septoria resistance and the late blight resistance to control all 3 diseases more tightly. We are arranging to conduct field trials of the parental materials in the F1s in farmers' fields while we are producing these other materials to get some feedback on, under different conditions, what sort of resistance we might be able to see. Next slide. Oh, I already said this. We've made advances during this summer. And so we are actually ahead of schedule for the work. Next slide. What's interesting is that this is a part of the total program. The overarching goal of my entire program is tomatoes that don't have to be sprayed with anything. So this project focuses on early blight because it's the weak link in the chain for the fungal diseases. Another project is transferring bacterial speck and spot resistance into the tomato lines with late blight, early blight, and septoria leaf spot resistance. So those 2 sub-projects will eventually combine together to have no fungicide and no copper sprays. And last but not least is a separate project where we have transferred a natural form of insect resistance from a wild tomato into similar lines. They actually have the late blight and the septoria leaf spot resistance in them. And this insect resistance controls, believe it or not, almost all of the pest species that attack tomato. Furthermore, we now have evidence that in controlling the thrips and the whitefly, they also impact whether the tospovirus and begomovirus vectored by those 2 species actually get into the plant tissue. So it looks like we might be affecting the insect-transmitted virus as well as the insects. And so that is geared towards eliminating pesticides. And so that is the overarching interactive parts of the 3 parts of my program.
Great.
And we are needing to surge outward for testing. The insect work we've tested in Florida, California, North Carolina. There's some work going on in Georgia. We have to go where there's insect pressure. The blight work, years ago we had some trials in North Carolina, West Virginia, but mostly we've had New York State. And as we get these other lines with the bacterial speck and spot and firmer control of the early blight, we're going to need to spread out as well to find out what the impact of the resistances are. One critical thing is that we can produce the resistance and get the seed companies to put it into the plants. But if we don't determine the impact this makes on control, nobody is going to be able to tell the growers, how does this affect your IPM program?
Right. That's great, Martha. I think that's a really important point. I'm going to have to cut you off at this point.
Okay.
To get to our next speaker, but maybe there'll be some time to do some questions at the break.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to move along here to Jennifer Hashley, and this is a project from the Northeastern IPM Center. And the title is Working with Small-Scale Producers on IPM Strategies, Lessons from Urban Agriculture, Small Ruminants, and Diverse Producers' Perspectives on Cultural Controls. And she's with Third Sector New England. So Jennifer, go ahead.
Yep, thank you. And Tufts University. Wanted to throw that in there too. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to talk about 2 of our projects. The first one was our small ruminant IPM working group that we did, and this followed a 2013 producer survey where we surveyed 165, or at least we had 165 respondents throughout New England. So I tried to help identify their most important IPM challenges, and out of that survey, internal parasites came back as the most costly issue that producers were facing, and particularly Homunculus contortus, the barber pole worm, was one of the main internal parasites that was identified, and mostly that's been exacerbated by the overuse of chemical dewormers and had a lot of resistance. So our goal with this working group project was to increase producer knowledge and awareness of IPM approaches for internal parasite control, since the adoption of current practices has been pretty uneven. So we wanted to raise their awareness of these practices, and part of that was helping them to increase the use of fecal egg counts as a monitoring and decision-making tool, and to focus on strategic pasture management and rotation and selective breeding, which also means actually culling animals that are consistent heavy worm load carriers. We also wanted to increase networking and collaboration between the working group members and identify new research needs. So our project partners in this grant held a series of farmer workshops across the region, introducing the concept of fecal egg counts, talking about pasture management, rotation, and selective breeding, and things like that. We had a roundtable meeting with our our farm service providers who are doing this work to talk about new research that they were working on, educational programming, and areas for collaboration. And then we've continued to maintain our New England Small Ruminant e-list listserv, so people regularly post on that about upcoming workshops or questions that they have, and that's a mix of both service providers and producers that are part of that. You can go to the next slide, just some photos of some of the workshops that we held, helping producers with Falacci, which is another way to identify whether animals have internal parasites, and some pasture management. We did some sheep herding workshops, basic animal care and husbandry, and then introducing the microscopes for folks to actually look through and practice doing their fecal egg counts. But we did find out we had hoped to establish a lending library of the microscopes and the McMaster slide kits for producers, and the folks who were real serious about using this in their flocks ended up just purchasing their own, because the logistics of kind of shipping microscopes around the region was not very effective. So the people that were feeling like this was a good tool for them ended up just investing in their own microscopes. So that is a quick and dirty summary of that project. And then the next slide is talking about our multi-year next generation urban IPM producer education project. So we partnered and pulled together groups of farmers from both our farmer group in Massachusetts with New Entry and the Urban Farming Institute of Boston, which mostly works in the very urban communities of Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester of Boston, primarily African-American low-income communities. We partnered with Cultivating Community up in Maine and the Lewiston area with their Somali farmers. And then we partnered with ORIS, the Office of Refugee and Immigrant Success in New Hampshire, with their group of also mostly African refugee folks. And so our goal was really to help these very diverse urban ag producers who are selling to direct markets, help them gain a better understanding of IPM practices to improve their crop quality, to more carefully and thoughtfully address disease and pest management so that they have reliable crops to supply. So a lot of what we did was each of the different organizations focused on their own particular educational programming, outreach, training, one-on-one technical assistance, crop quality, some of them partnered with Extension to come on board and do some IPM training. Our particular program focused a lot on soil health and cover cropping and breaking the pest, disease, and weed cycles, learning about scouting, things like that. So more of the broad definition of, prevent before you spray, IPM techniques. And so there are a lot of different types of educational programming. I liked this picture, wanted to include this on the slide. The folks at the Urban Farming Institute were just fascinated by the tomato hornworm. One of the participants named himself the Nightshade King, and they ended up developing this little kind of comic cartoon about the destroyer wasps coming in to, pollinate the tomato hornworm. So people kind of took the IPM and beneficial insect thing to a whole new level, which was really great. So yeah, we hosted a lot of workshops, did a lot of technical assistance. We also had the projects monitor their revenue over the period of the grant, and all projects saw an increase of between 9 and 20% of their crop quality over this period of time due to the increased education. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's really interesting. The question, one of them I had was, in your numbers, I mean, I know this program's been going for a few years now. Are you seeing increasing numbers? And then the second part to that is, what's the level of knowledge of these folks coming into the program? Do they know absolutely nothing? Do they know a few things? What are you seeing with that?
Do you mean increasing numbers of participants that are wanting to learn to farm?
Just
that the
those that
question?
are involved in your programs. Are you seeing, does that continue to increase? How is that? Because it seems like you're providing a very important service to, groups that might not be aware of it. And I would think there would be, increasing participation every year. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, I would say so. We've tried to do a better job of kind of filtering participants because the type of training and education that we provide is very costly, as you can imagine, because we take people from, I think I want to farm, to, okay, let's really explore that. Let's do some self-assessment. Then we're going to make you actually take a 9-week business planning course, and you have to actually write a business plan. So that's another filtering thing. And then people can get onto our incubator farms and rent land from us for up to 3 years. And then they get, more hands-on training, one-on-one technical assistance in the field, business coaching, access to capital, access to our food hub with a distribution network built in, and then hopefully land matching services so they go on and continue to farm. So we try to create and cast a wide net and do a lot of outreach to a lot of different communities and through farming conferences and emails and anywhere people find us. And we definitely have a lot of interest in our sort of explore farming aspect, which is the first step of that pathway process. And then we try to whittle that down a little bit and narrow who takes our business planning course. We're being a little more selective and trying to have the fall class be people that are really going to get on the land in the next year that have prior farming experience, and the winter class being folks that are still unsure but feel like they really want to develop a business plan for next steps. So yeah, I think we see continual interest. I think the challenge for us is that our audience has been shifting to more folks who do not have as much commercial farming background experience. To your second question, in the past, when we worked with immigrants and refugees who come here with farming background, and that's just, they've grown up farming, it's in their blood. Now we get a lot of mid-career changers or retirees or folks that have maybe had a small garden, but it is not necessarily commercial level farm experience. So they have to learn everything. And IPM and all of those principles are a huge piece of that. So we are actually now considering adding, or actively planning to add, a crop production course as an interim step between explore farming and the farm business planning course for people who have limited commercial production experience, because we're finding that it's really hard to ask somebody to write a business plan when they've actually never gotten their hands that dirty in the soil to know, like, well, what are their yields? What can they expect to get? What are some of the issues they're going to need to do? How do they know what materials and supplies they need on that kind of scale to put into the cash flow projection or their startup budget? So we're kind of needing to do, and we never thought we wanted to be a farm school because we felt like we were just, sort of an entrepreneurial business incubator program. Like, people already need to know how to produce their product, but that's definitely shifting. Yeah.
Great. So thank you, Jennifer. We're at the about the 3-minute mark before our next group of speakers, and I think I thought the comment by Martha that the goal is to have no spray tomatoes. I think that's important. What is the goal? And I think a lot of these all of you have goals, and you want to move your programs and your research in a direction that I think is sustainable, is integrated. And that's really what the purpose of this is to talk about that. And I think there's, different aspects to that. So, and if folks are, wanting to find out more, I know we've had some chat questions. We even had a question that was done in Spanish. So thank you, Cesar, for addressing that question on the chat box. I don't see any let me check the Q&A. No, we don't have any questions. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start just a little bit early on the next section. I know it's only 10:58.